Hello. In this video I want to briefly examine the events following the ending of the Sino-Japanese War in 1895 up until the establishment of the Anglo-Japanese alliance a mere 7 years later in 1902. Both events were of enormous significance in changing power relations in East Asia. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, the subject of the next video, soon followed with further momentous consequences. Let us begin with the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which ended the Sino-Japanese War. In a short war lasting less than 9 months, the Japanese had thoroughly defeated the Chinese, both on land and sea. At the end of the war, Japanese troops were in occupation of a significant part of southern Manchuria, including the strategically important Liaodong Peninsula, as well as the important Chinese naval base of Weihai, the port city of Haichao, and the Pescadores Islands in the south. Over and again, poorly motivated Chinese troops had retreated before the Japanese advance, and Chinese naval power, formerly regarded as the major force in East Asian waters, had been humiliatingly destroyed. Negotiations to end the war began on the 20th of March in the southern Japanese port city of Shimonoseki. Further Japanese victories outside of the original war zone made it more difficult for the Chinese representatives to resist Japanese demands. The final treaty was signed on the 17th of April, 1895. The main provisions were as follows. First, Chinese recognition of the complete independence of Korea and the ending of all formalities which implied Chinese suzerainty. Second, Chinese ceding of territory to Japan, comprising 3 elements. First, an eastern section of the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur with its fortifications and arsenals. Second, the Pescadores Islands, and thirdly, the great island of Formosa, Taiwan, in the south. The third provision of the treaty was the payment of a huge indemnity by the Chinese to Japan, amounting to 200 million silver taels, about 7.5 million kilograms of silver, a vast amount of money. Finally, the Chinese agreed to open 4 Chinese ports to Japanese trade and grant Japan most favored nation status. The treaty was a key event in East Asian history, signaling the decline of China and the rise of Japan. As such, it was a powerful indication that the Japanese style of emulation of Western institutions and thinking brought rapid results, in contrast to the more traditionalistic Chinese responses to the West. For the Chinese, the losing of the war was a major humiliation. Unlike the Western powers that had previously attacked them, Japan had traditionally been seen as a subordinate part of a Chinese-dominated world. The defeat also sparked off fresh attempts at Chinese modernization, which were soon cut short by traditionalists seizing control of government, with disastrous results, which I will describe in another video. For the Japanese, by contrast, the war was a vindication of their policy of forced and rapid change. It also increased their prestige internationally and established them as a major regional power. In the short run, however, Japanese ambitions received an almost immediate check from Russia, France, and Germany, which quickly intervened diplomatically to prevent Japan acquiring Port Arthur and any part of the Liaodong Peninsula. This triple intervention, as it was called, was headed by Russia, which saw Japanese gains in Manchuria as a direct challenge to its own East Asian ambitions. Russia was supported by the French because of the Franco-Russian alliance, and by Germany, probably because of Germany's own ambitions for empire in the East. The demand for a change in the treaty was made on the 23rd of April, a mere 6 days after the treaty had been signed. Faced with a united front by 3 powerful European states, the Japanese government reluctantly accepted. Without support from other powerful countries, such as the United States or Britain, it did not dare risk a confrontation. Accordingly, in return for a massive increase in the size of the Chinese indemnity, up by 30 million taels, equivalent to over 1 million kilograms of silver, to a total of over 8,500 tons of silver, the Japanese government announced on the 5th of May that Japanese forces would be withdrawn from the Liaodong Peninsula, The formal retrocession of the territory to China was made in November, and all Japanese forces had been withdrawn by the end of the year. Japan retained only Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands, which I will talk about at another time. For the Japanese, worse was to follow their retrocession of mainland territory. Having denied Japanese claims to territory on the Chinese mainland, the great powers proceeded to take Chinese territory for themselves. China's defeat revealed the full extent of its weakness, and the great powers were eager to take advantage of it. The way was led by Russia in 1896, when it gained Chinese acceptance for a Russian-built railway line to be constructed across northern Manchuria as part of Russia's Trans-Siberian Railway project, and permission to use several Chinese ports in the event of a future war. Construction work on the railway began in 1897 and was mostly completed by 1901. The new railway, the Chinese Eastern Railway, remained essentially a Russian line on Chinese soil, with a new Russian town constructed at Harbin. It was a vital link in securing Russian power in East Asia and strengthening its naval base at Vladivostok. This Russian initiative was followed by one by Germany in 1897. The establishment of a German naval base in China had been a long-running goal of German planners, and the brutal murder of 2 German Roman Catholic priests in southern Shandong on the 1st of November 1897 provided an excuse for intervention, with Kaiser Wilhelm II personally urging the commander of the German cruiser squadron in East Asian waters to act. Accordingly, a small German force seized the town of Tsingtao on the southern coast of Shandong on the 14th of November, and soon consolidated its hold over the area around the whole of the Kiaochao Bay. More troops arrived in January to secure German control of the area, and negotiations began with the Chinese government to decide upon the area's future, the German government settling for a 99-year lease on the territory rather than outright annexation. Accordingly, the Bay Area became a German protectorate, still nominally part of China, but entirely administered by Germany. An additional 50-kilometer deep security zone was designated to surround the colony, and Germany was granted the right to construct railway lines and mine local coal deposits. The colony's primary importance to Germany was as a naval base, administration therefore being placed under the Imperial Navy, and a modern port developed to serve Germany's Pacific Squadron. This enabled Germany to become a significant East Asian power. The Germans invested heavily in their new colony, creating a model new town with wide streets, high-quality water supply and sewer systems, and an electricity grid, luxuries in most of Asia at this time. They also built up a well-funded school system at primary, secondary, and vocational levels. The Germans also came to dominate much of the Shandong Peninsula economically, which came to be seen as their sphere of influence. By 1910 they had completed the economically and strategically significant Shandong Railway. The German seizure of Tsingtao was quickly followed by the Russian seizure of Port Arthur in December 1897, the Chinese reluctantly agreeing to a 25-year lease of their strategic southern Liaotang Peninsula and allowing the Russians to build a spur to their developing railway to link Port Arthur in the south to Harbin in the north, known later as the Southern Manchuria Railway, another very important strategic line. Possession of Port Arthur gave the Russians a second base for their Pacific fleet, and one which, unlike Vladivostok, was not closed by ice in wintertime. It also gave them control over the maritime approach to Tianjin, and thus to Beijing. These 2 significant plums, pulled from the Chinese pie, were followed by 3 more, as the French and British demanded equivalent concessions to those granted to Germany and Russia. Thus, in May 1898, the French took Guangzhou in the far south, close to Hainan Island, on a long-term lease. Intended as a competitor to British Hong Kong, it was of little importance, however, functioning essentially as an annex to French Indochina. Far more importantly, the British obtained a lease on Weihai, the major Chinese naval base on the northern coast of Shandong, as a means of balancing Russian influence across the Yellow Sea. In a separate development, the British also acquired a 99-year lease on the so-called New Territories, so as to allow the further extension of their flourishing trading port of Hong Kong. These cumulative humiliations were too much for an increasing number of Chinese to bear, both at an elite and popular level, leading to the outbreak of the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, which I will discuss elsewhere. The Boxer Rebellion led to international intervention by forces of the Eight-Nation Alliance, comprising the European great powers, together with the United States and Japan. One element of this intervention of particular note was a massive Russian invasion of Manchuria with something like 100,000 men. This was completely separate from the multinational invasion and occupation of Beijing, and involved only Russian troops. After fierce fighting, the Russians overwhelmed the Manchu bannermen, who were their primary opponents, and successfully occupied the province. Guerrilla warfare, by those whom the Russians termed bandits, continued, and the Russians responded harshly, burning down villages and massacring civilians. Russia's intentions to create a permanent colony were made clear when it did not evacuate its troops from Manchuria after the Boxer Protocol ending the conflict had been signed by the other powers. With support for China from Japan and Britain, diplomatic pressure was now exerted to encourage the Russians to comply, but the response was only partial, troops being kept in place to guard the Russian railways and other facilities, but withdrawn from the hinterland. For the Japanese, the successive Western interventions provided an illuminating example of the use of force and the threat of force by the great powers to make gains over weaker nations. The standard of international morality was also demonstrated further afield by the Spanish-American War of 1898, which led to the United States acquiring possession of the Philippines and the island of Guam, making it for the first time a nation power. As some Japanese commentators observed, if the Americans claimed to have gone to war with Spain in order to help achieve Cuban freedom and independence, it was strange that they had used that same war to impose colonial rule on the Philippines. Increasingly, Japanese statesmen mulled the possibilities of an international alliance, the absence of which had made them weak in the face of the triple intervention. Various possibilities were considered, but the only one that bore fruit was with Britain. For their own reasons, the British had decided to end their traditional neutrality in world affairs, and rather than pursue a European alliance, chose to ally with Japan. Both Britain and Japan were island nations with complex relationships with their respective continents, and trading links between the two countries were growing to their mutual advantage. The British had also played a major role in helping the Japanese to build up their sea power. But what united them most particularly at this particular juncture was their shared opposition to further Russian expansion in Asia. Discussions between the British Foreign Secretary and the Japanese Minister in London began in 1901, and a formal alliance was signed on the 30th of January 1902. Modest in scope, reflecting the uncertainties which both sides had about their relationship, the alliance was a revolution in international affairs. For the British, the alliance marked an end to their long-standing policy of international isolation and neutrality. For the Japanese, it marked their final accession to the privileged club of major powers. As they were also well aware, at a time of growing racism in Europe, it marked an acceptance by one of the greatest of the white European powers of a relationship of equality and mutual respect for an Asian power. The alliance stood in obvious contrast to the appalling humiliations heaped out on the Chinese by the Europeans. The main provisions of the treaty were as follows. First, whilst recognizing the independence of China and Japan, it was acknowledged that Britain had special interests in China, and Japan had special interests in both China and Korea, and that both powers had the right to protect those interests. To that end, it was recognized that if either power was threatened by a third power, or by disturbances in China or Korea, then intervention to safeguard the lives and properties of their subjects was justified. Thirdly, it was decided that if either British or Japanese intervention led to war with a third power, then the other signatory would remain neutral. Fourthly, if such intervention led either Britain or Japan into a war with more than one country, then the other signatory would abandon neutrality and provide support for it. Thus, in the Russo-Japanese War, which began a mere 2 years after the signing of this treaty, Japan acted to safeguard its interests in Korea, and the British remained neutral. If France, as Russia's ally, had agreed to support Russia in the war, then in accordance with the Anglo-Japanese treaty, then Britain would have been obligated to come to Japan's aid. I will examine the Russo-Japanese War in the next video. Thank you.